Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lost in Translation show, where we explore yesterday to understand what is happening to mankind today. I am your host, Simone. Today I am broadcasting from Newport Beach, California, where the sand meets the surf. People come from all over the world to enjoy this beautiful piece of coastline. Visiting a town like this can really make the troubles of the world seem far, far away. My trip has been very relaxing, with bike rides near the beach, visiting family and friends, watching the boats drift by, and having some lovely meals in the surfside restaurants. It's hard to believe that summer is almost over and that the rest of the world is not as peaceful or welcoming as Newport on a hot, sunny day. I hope that someday some of you can visit this lovely seaside resort and enjoy the tranquility of the Newport coast. And here's hoping that my listeners are enjoying the summer months too. Thank you for joining me today to discuss the tensions between the United States and China over Taiwan. Hopefully, the information presented in this blog over the last several months has given my listeners a better understanding of the power structures that control our lives. My goal has been to illustrate how the world state of chaos, including the rising political tensions that we can see occurring around us right now, were conceived, planned, implemented, funded, and continue to be executed by transgenerational familial power structures with the long-term goal of authoritarian rule of the planet. Like other shows, we will use the words, documents, photos, and public statements of the parties under discussion to demonstrate the validity of the point your attention is being directed to. As always, please use your own judgment and do your own research. Come to your own conclusions about the topics under discussion. My assertion is that knowledge is power. The average person has no immediate power against the intimidating and ruthless powers that manipulate and control our lives. But over time, with new knowledge being shared with the masses every day, this information can change our destinies and our futures. At least new ideas and perspectives can open our minds to new concepts that are outside the mainstream media, academia, and government's plans. The job of these institutions is to cloud history and the news to fit their puppet masters' agendas and divide the people. People all over the world are no longer accepting the totalitarian agenda being put forth by many world leaders. The riots, government overthrows, the financial collapses, and mass demonstrations occurring worldwide are being suppressed by the media. We too, as a society, can push back on the plans of the few who wish to enslave the many. No matter where you go in the world, the same group of people is in power. There are more of us than there are of them. The first step is to change how we respond to world events. Sometimes unknowingly, we're supporting and participating in funding our own destruction and enslavement. We have to change how we respond to world events and how we react to the lies and deceptions of our leaders. The goal of this channel is to prompt thought, to stimulate new ideas, new solutions, and new ways of interacting with our fellow man, especially our friends, family, and neighbors. Stop arguing with each other. Focus on who is in control of the banking system and the actions of their employees, meaning our politicians, the military-industrial complex, and most corporate heads, have and are doing. As long as the powers that be can pit us against one another, the chaos will continue, and their dark plans for the planet will progress. Following is a prime example of the manipulation and lies the general public is fed on a daily basis. Understanding the China-United States conflict. What is really going on between the political classes of China and the United States governments? How does the conflict between China and Taiwan affect the average American citizen? To really understand this rising conflict, we must understand the history of the dispute between China and the Western powers that has continued both before and after World War II. Over the last several months, we have learned about the privately held Federal Reserve Bank system and their power over most of the world's population. We have explored the connections of the Federal Reserve bankers and their operatives, otherwise known as our politicians, our corporate heads, the media, Hollywood, the military-industrial complex, and academia. This group of power structures, known as the hidden hand, has caused most of the conflicts on this planet. The same group is responsible for the recent actions in China. Why are our public officials contributing to the long-term tensions between these two powers, contrary to the agreements that the United States signed with China? In my past presentations, I have asserted and provided supporting documents to demonstrate that all wars are bankers' wars, and that most of the atrocities committed over the last several hundred years were committed by the Federal Reserve operatives led by the City of London. And of course, Wall Street. They both serve the Vatican political structure. The documents have demonstrated that the same bankers have instigated and funded the mass genocides and wars of the last several hundred years to bring about the New World Order that is trying to control the planet today. What the viewers will discover throughout this presentation is that the situation between the European bankers, the United States, and the Chinese goes back much further than one would realize. In fact, it started hundreds of years ago in the City of London. The City of London is not part of England and is owned by the Vatican. Much like the city of Washington, D.C., D.C. is not part of the United States, but owned by the Vatican. Please look back to my previous presentations that have documents to support these statements, or refer to Roman law books and look up lex mori, or Roman local law that is used to govern Washington, D.C. Contrary to the agreement signed by the United States in the 1970s with the goal of normalizing relations with China, and the agreements that led to the subsequent withdrawal of U.S. troops after World War II, United States politicians continue to break the long-standing agreement with China and interfere in Taiwan. This is by no means a glowing review of the Communist Party in China, and certainly not an excuse for this bloodthirsty political party's actions against their own people. This is an attempt to apply critical analysis and not emotion to explain what the United States officials are doing to incite a possible war with China. This presentation will include research and images from the Financial Times, Bloomberg News, and some YouTube channels like The Truth Unedited. These reports will demonstrate the connections to the founding, funding, and takeover of the country of China by the Rothschild City of London bankers that started in the 1800s and continues to this day. As I have explained in past presentations, the politicians in the United States work for the private corporation of the City of London. Again, they do not serve the people they claim to serve. Our politicians work for the same bankers that funded and murdered tens of millions in China, the same bankers that funded Mao, and the same bankers that want Taiwan right now. First, let's get a snapshot of what is going on in China today. Please pay close attention to the details of the bankers' strategies, because what is happening in China today is a glimpse of what this group has planned for the rest of the world in the near future. Their words, not mine. As many of you may recall, my first podcast was launched on President's Day in 2022. The text of this podcast is the reading of President Kennedy's speech. The words in this powerful speech still hold deep meaning today. It does not matter if you like Kennedy or not. His words are meaningful as applied to the world situation. He implores us to look within ourselves and examine our own attitude toward war. That mankind can achieve anything they set their minds to, including peace. His speech reflects my own views of war and my firm belief that man created his own problems, therefore he can fix his own problems. It is with this speech in mind that I present the following information that contradicts the mainstream narrative of the politicians, the media, and much of the public that often bases their opinions and subsequent actions on what these two groups say. As I have said before, I do not support war of any kind, regardless of what nationality or race the children are that are being sent to fight a war. All wars are bankers' wars. There are no exceptions. Neighbor is pitted against neighbor to achieve the bankers' long-term goals of total totalitarian rule over the planet. Please join me as I do what President Kennedy implores every citizen to do, and that is look inward and examine our own views on war. So let's begin. The Chinese economy. The country of China's economy has been and is collapsing. The CCP is deploying police nationwide to control the protesters. 5 rural banks in China have gone broke, and many more are in trouble. 400,000 account holders have had their accounts frozen and are unable to withdraw even the smallest sums of money. This equals about 2 trillion yuan in Chinese currency. In addition, mortgage holders are refusing to pay 300 billion in loan payments because the property developers are not delivering houses. The news has been full of stories about Evergreen, the largest property development company in the world, and their troubles paying their bond debt. The Evergreen crisis has been well publicized for some time, but its entities have failed to complete real estate projects pre-sold since 2013. People in China are refusing to pay their mortgages on 301 projects in 91 cities. The real estate market has dropped 20% in August, and construction starts are down by 30% on other projects. The government has cut the interest rate on the loans and announced that people do not need to pay the mortgages on houses that do not exist. About 34.5% of the money for the new construction came from pre-sales of the projects that have not been delivered in this pyramid scheme. Now the people are refusing to pay their mortgages. There is no money to finish the homes. Like all Ponzi schemes, when the fresh money cannot be collected from new investors, then used to pay past debts, the scheme implodes. Excuse me, I just realized that I had been saying Evergreen, but I meant Evergrande. The graphics on the screen are correct. Another $58 billion in loans are expected to default soon. The builders do not have the money to finish those projects either. To top the whole situation off, the government claims the banks that went under had fraud related to their failure. Hence, they will most likely not pay insurance to the account holders for their losses in the 5 rural banks. To prevent the people from demonstrating, the Chinese CCP is using the zero-tolerance CV regulations. For instance, one of the first men to rebel against the bank closures was held by the government at least 2 times under the pandemic rules. He did not have the flu, but his social credit score said that he did. Likewise, when the bank protesters went to protest at the banking commission offices, they found they had been changed from green to red in the social credit system, claiming they had the flu too. This is not the only serious issue China is facing today due to the eugenics programs of the Chinese government and their one-child policy that was put in place from 1979 to 2016. The birth rate in China is 1.15. The birth rate just to maintain and replace the current population, China needs a birth rate of 2.1. This demographic collapse is part of the New World Order's plan to reduce the world population to 500 million people. On a side note, many of my listeners may have heard of the Georgia Guidestones. According to the government offices in Georgia, no one knows who built the monument, who maintains the grounds and upkeep of the monument, or how they came to have a street named after the monument. Regardless of these minor details, this monument was bulldozed in the middle of the night recently, but no one knows who removed them or why there has been no investigation of their destruction. For those of you who don't know about the Guidestones, the Georgia Guidestones were a mysterious monument that memorialized the New World Order's plans to reduce the population to 500 million people by 2030. This group, that is powerful enough to erect a monument that calls for the murder of over 7 billion people, plans to cull the herd in order to save the planet. Observers remain curious as to who erected the monument, who tore it down, and finally what remains in the time capsules below the ground. Like I said, this group is very open about their long-term goals for the planet and us. They've already been testing their theories and practices in China for the last 100 years. But I digress. Let's get back to China. The CCP aborted over tens of millions of women during the implementation of the one-child policy in China. These policies have resulted in millions of Chinese men who will never have a wife or a family, but are ready to fight in the military. The eugenics programs of the CCP in countries like Russia and China and other former socialist communist countries are facing the same low birth rates and possible extinction of their people. Again, the goal of the New World Order crowd is to bring all countries and their peoples into one world government, one world military, and one world religion. The Chinese people have been under this group's control for over 100 years. They are executing their plan right in front of us right now. Historic American, European, and Chinese relations. Let's explore the narrative being presented to the American public by our politicians, the media, and big corporations. China is going to invade the sovereign nation of Taiwan. Apparently, these various factions have forgotten the agreements made in the early 1970s when the United States, under President Nixon and the guidance of Henry Kissinger, normalized relations with the country of China. The final negotiations in these talks reflect the public position of both the United States and China. The United States government agreed that Taiwan was part of China. Some text from the negotiations is on the screen now, and the full document is easily available online. So why, if the United States agreed that Taiwan was part of China to normalize relations with our former adversary, are prominent politicians poking the eye of the Chinese government by backing Taiwan as an independent country? Under this 1970s agreement, the United States closed their bases and removed their military presence in Taiwan. Once again, the breach of this agreement is most likely the unseen hand of the Rothschild banking cartel, the same criminal cartel that planned, funded, trained, and then steered the Communist Party into power in China. The Opium Wars. This group first funded the Opium Wars in China, addicting large portions of the Chinese population to opium and destroying the 5,000-year-old culture, the oldest one remaining on Earth at that time. Not just to erase history, but to gain control of the silver, gold, silk, and tea commodities that they wanted to steal instead of pay for. China and England had been involved in trade for years, but the Rothschild cartel did not want to pay the Chinese for their commodities. So began their centuries-long attack on the Chinese culture and its economy. It took 2 centuries, but the bankers and their operatives have destroyed the old China and have implemented their track, trace, and punish slave system over its former empire, basically turning industrious people into slaves that fear their government and have used eugenics or abortion via the one-child policy to decimate an entire group of people. By the way, if you listen to Chinese politicians, the drugs like fentanyl being sent to the United States and Europe are payback for the atrocity committed over the centuries on their population by the Western powers. The Rothschild family line is of Turkish descent, and opium was grown and exported from Turkey to China. These infiltration and destruction practices of the Rothschild banking cartel are very easy to research. So let's explore how this group of families that I have discussed in previous podcasts is responsible for the China we see today, the bloodshed of tens of millions of people, and the current power of the Communist Party. In 1953, the Rothschild bankers were first to reestablish contact with China after World War II. They opened offices in Shanghai, Hong Kong, Beijing, and had a partnership that operated in South Korea. According to the Rothschild archives, they became the leading advisor to the Chinese government on its investments in Europe. Again, these bankers had funded the Communist Party to power, and now they were in complete control of China via the banking system. Are these practices sounding familiar to anyone who listened to my History of the Federal Reserve podcast, where I point out the different countries the same group of people have done this same activity in for the last few hundred years? But the Rothschilds have been active with the Chinese leadership since at least 1838 during the rule of Daojing. He was the seventh and last emperor of the Qing dynasty, or the Middle Kingdom. China had closed its economy to the West years before to prevent the Western influences and control their population. The European bankers did not like being blocked from China's markets, so the Opium Wars were fought. The banking powers imported opium to China, enslaved their population, and then stole their natural resources. Britain had much more advanced warships, weapons, and military strategies than the Chinese at that time. As a result of the Anglo-Chinese treaties that were signed in 1842 and 1848, China was forced to open their ports and change their banking practices. The Rothschilds established merchant houses after the war to trade commodities. This expansion was headed by a man named Jardine Matheson. They opened the Hong Kong Bank in China with its head office in the City of London. By 1895, Deutsche Bank, the Bank of Germany, was involved in this expansion too. This fueled the rise and takeover of China by the Communist Party years later in 1928. During this time, two big banks rose to power, the Hong Kong Bank and the Shanghai Banking Corporation Limited. Today, this bank is known as HSBC. According to the media, this bank is in serious trouble. These treaties also led to the rise of the Asiatic Deutsche Bank in 1895. Since the fall of the Qing dynasty in the 1800s, China had been in turmoil, making them ripe for revolution. But was the rise of the Communist Party a natural occurrence in the Chinese population, or was the hidden hand involved in this mass bloodshed and enslavement of billions of people? You guessed it. The same group of bankers who did not want to pay China for its commodities, imported opium to addict the masses, are the descendants of the same bankers who promoted and trained the young leaders of the communist movement. China had been united under the communist rule of Mao and was now another nation owned by the City of London bankers, otherwise known as the Hidden Hand. How did communism get to China? So some of you might be wondering, how did the philosophy of Karl Marx, a man born in Germany, make its way to the isolated, far-off country of China? Let's think about this question for a minute. Could it be that Karl Marx propaganda was brought to China via the Rothschilds? The same group of bankers who was funding and implementing the Opium Wars and a New World Order? This might sound far-fetched to people who have not watched my previous podcast where I outline the Hegelian dialectic, which many of Marx's theories stem from, and how the Federal Reserve Rothschild-controlled banking system rules governments, plans wars, and controls corporations. The Hegelian dialectic is based on problem, reaction, solution. First, this group creates a problem, then they manage the reaction, then they present the solution that they had always wanted in the first place. Consider this. Could this be the current strategy of these bankers? First, inciting the public against China. Second, getting the general population to support a war with China over Taiwan, regardless of the agreement signed between our two nations. And then to provide a solution of military force to take Taiwan that the same group has wanted since the 1800s. Henry Kissinger, the man who led the normalization of trade and relations with China in 1970s, frequently quotes Hegel's dialectic after his New World Order crowd accomplishes one of their goals. I ask you again, could this strategy be one that the bankers are using on us right now? But how about this? Adolf Hitler and Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, who is the leader of the New World Order movement, and Karl Marx were all Rothschild bloodline. As you can see on the family tree, Marx is related to the Levi Barent Cohen family of Amsterdam. If you do your research, all movements including socialism, communism, fascism, and Zionism are all fronts for Karl Marx and his plan for communist rule of the planet. Please refer to my last podcast on Admiralty Law, communism, and living in the matrix for a better understanding of who, how, and why communism began and who controls and funds this movement to this day. So now that we have a better understanding that Karl Marx himself was a Rothschild, the grand deception on the masses is exposed. Communism is the way this group of bankers can control the world's population under Admiralty Law. To ensure the success of communism, the Yale Divinity Schools were opened in China. Yale in China was an intelligence operation to overthrow the government by this Anglo-American group whose most successful student was Mao. Yes, the man who murdered tens of millions of his own people, that Mao. Reuben Holden, George Bush's senior cousin, was a head of the OSS operation and also a member of Skull and Bones. The OSS was an intelligence arm of the U.S. government until the CIA was put in place. Many people may be unaware that George Bush Sr. was adopted by Prescott Bush from Hitler's inner circle. This is according to other people who were extracted at the same time George Bush was. Prescott was the union banker who financed the Nazi Party in Germany and the communist overthrow of the Russian Empire via Wall Street and the City of London. The Union Bank was the brainchild of Adolf Hitler. This bank has funded many atrocities since. George Bush Sr. was eventually put in charge of the CIA, and this group's subversive activities continue to this day. It has taken several hundred years and hundreds of millions of lives, but the Vatican B system of the Federal Reserve remains in place. Its operatives continue to manipulate the public into their long-term plans of one world military, one world government, and one world religion. I will leave you with this one question. Why, if this new world government is so perfect and we are all so blissful because religion no longer divides the people, why do they need a one world military? Who will this military be serving? And what does that mean for the future of humanity? The United States goes off the gold standard. Something else very important happened in 1971. The impact of this decision is still being felt today. The American dollar is a fiat currency with no assets backing the dollar, hence the primary cause of inflation in 2022. That's right, our money is just paper printed from thin air. This way, the banking cartel can print money anytime they choose without gold or any other asset backing the banknote. These bankers have used the dollar to buy assets like real estate and commodities. They have used fiat currency to take control of most assets on the planet. Please watch my Inflation and You podcast to understand more about the causes and effects of inflation. Nixon announced the United States would go off the gold standard at the same time we were normalizing relations with China. Coincidence? According to David Rockefeller, an agent of the Rothschild family, the Iron Curtain must be replaced by a plate glass window between China and Russia and the West. Let me remind you, the same City of London bankers and the Wall Street bankers that collapsed China had funded the genocide in Russia via the Bolshevik Revolution, just like they had caused revolutions in many other countries in the past. In both places, this group succeeded in implementing the communist slave system that killed over 150 million people. David Rockefeller was the head of Chase Manhattan Bank and controlled every major industry in the United States. including airlines, AT&T, most of the oil companies, the media companies, and more. Henry Kissinger, another extracted Nazi and cabinet member of Nixon, was an operative of the Rockefeller family. He made numerous secret trips to China on behalf of and funded by Rockefeller and Chase Bank. This chain of events is well documented in Rockefeller's book, Memories, and another book, The Rockefellers, An American Dynasty. Rockefeller tells a group of people in March of 1971 about the new U.S. policy with China. In 1972, the United States and China signed the Shanghai Communique, where the United States military agreed to vacate Taiwan and normalize relations and open trade with the West. Again, the U.S. concedes in writing that Taiwan belongs to China. Since the normalization of relations with China, the economies in the Western nations have shipped their businesses and industry and technology to China. The operatives of this system have hollowed out the industrial base of most nations and transferred their economy's wealth, thus creating an economic system that we live under today. Communists use slave and forced labor to fill the pockets of the Chinese leadership, the international bankers, and the people who brought communism to the masses, the Rothschild banking cartel. These groups of people continue to implement the beast system, aka communism, for their ruler, the Pope, and his political system, the Vatican. Again, the politicians and world leaders understand the treaty signed in 1972, where the USA government agrees that Taiwan is part of China. So why are they risking a war with China and talking nonsense to the world? This is the question that prompted me to make this podcast. I do not support the Chinese Communist Party, and I do not support our country entering into agreements that they did not live up to, and then send our young people to war to defend their lives. The chaos continues from these same groups that were created to further the agenda of the New World Order bankers and to take control of everyone on the planet using admiralty law and the banking system via taxation to control us. In conclusion, this was just a brief overview of how the United States, the Western European empires, and China have come to this place in history today. Will world leaders and their puppets in the media continue to push for war and mislead the public about the conflict boiling over in China right now? The system the CCP put in place in China is collapsing. Like many times in the past, will this same group of people start wars and conflicts to cover the failures of their system? This is a repeatedly failed system that resulted in mass bloodshed over the last 125 years. Why are these groups of people forcibly trying to implement this failed system worldwide as I make this podcast? These are just some of the questions the global people should be asking themselves right now. In fact, shouldn't we be asking our politicians and military leadership why they decided to break the Shanghai Communique that opened China to the West in the first place? Instead, ask them why they are blatantly lying to the public and inciting a war. Why don't they just say the government has changed its policy, similar to the government's policy changes towards China in the 1970s? This seems like it would make more sense. Of course, most politicians have been and are personally benefiting from investments they made in China and Taiwan under the Communist Party rule. This podcast would be really long if I listed the conflicts of interest politicians on both sides of the aisle have in China and Russia, too, for that matter. Our leadership propped up the failing system in China in the 1970s, giving them new industry, funding, and technology. The politicians are the same operatives that made laws, taxes, and regulations that drove industry out of the United States and other developed nations. Not just investments made by our politicians, but large amounts of money paid to them or their family members to pursue the communist agenda outside China, while enriching themselves financially beyond the average person's comprehension. That means corporate leadership and our public servants from both political parties have benefited. The people calling out the loudest and making the biggest threats have a huge financial stake in what goes on in Taiwan. Does the term conflict of interest mean anything to any of our public officials? Because most of them have law degrees. Should these people on both sides of the aisle that work for a foreign power have the right to send your relative or your neighbor to war to protect their business investments and their power? I say no. I have demonstrated who these so-called representatives of the people really work for, and it is not you. Every day it becomes more and more obvious they do not work for the people who voted for them, nor do they appear to have any desire to remain calm or calm the tensions with a country that has a standing military much larger than the United States. A few months ago it was Ukraine, now it's Taiwan, and soon they will probably turn our attention to Indonesia. All three countries have high-level biolabs funded by the United States government programs under Obama. Many of these labs were involved in programs that were banned in the West. Why are our leaders funding biolabs in countries hostile to the United States? Those same leaders who funded these labs are yelling the loudest for war right now and lying the most about the details of the conflicts. Remember, the war machine fuels the bankers' financial schemes by eliminating the people and governments who won't consent to their rule, and then traps generations of people under tax debt. Regardless if their country lost the war or won the war. For instance, the United States is still footing the bill to rebuild Europe and then fund NATO. NATO is for the defense of Europe, not the United States. What are American people paying for? Remember, the Hegelian dialectic. First, they create the problem, then they manage the reaction, then they provide the solution that they always wanted in the first place. Could that be what's going on between China and the West right now? As President Kennedy said in his speech, we must each consider our own attitudes toward war, to look inward and understand that war is not the answer, that man can solve any problem because man who created the problems. Kennedy, during his presidency, was fighting the same hidden hand of the banking cartel and its intelligence forces that seek to control the planet right now. From the research presented on this channel, both the leadership of the CCP and most of the leadership in the Western nations both work for and are funded by the same power structure. If they both work for the same power structure, then who are these groups and who are the militaries that we're really fighting? This is the question the public should be asking themselves. It appears this group causes the problems, but we fight each other, and then this power structure gets what they want. Think about that. On a positive note, the beast system, also known and led by people in the cult of Phoenix, is under siege worldwide right now. The Rothschilds Bank has been taking itself private, and for several years was buying about a third of the gold production available worldwide. You can research and find out that the family assets have been auctioned off in major auction houses. Members of the family, including the heir to the Rothschild fortune, have died of heart attacks, helicopter explosions, and suicide over the last several years. The Vatican City went dark for at least a week after Biden took office. The Vatican is the head of the beast, and hundreds of Vatican bankers, including the head of the Vatican Bank and his son, are currently in prison for their crimes. Private lawsuits and judgments are now being brought and won against the Vatican bankers too. Members of the European Union Parliament and various European royals and bankers are being exposed for their crimes and either stepping down or going to prison. Again, the royal families of Europe and the New World Order, it's the same gang at the European Union, and they are owned and controlled by the Vatican. They do not serve the people. It has been reported in the independent media that both Biden's complex in the Ukraine and Obama's complex in Indonesia have been raided by the military in the last 18 months. Their operatives in media, academia, and government are being exposed daily for their crimes. The question is, what power structure will replace the current one? The biolabs funded by these same two men as president and vice president are now closed in Wuhan and the Ukraine. Let's watch Indonesia and this group's response to the closing of the biolabs there. The Chinese banking system is collapsing, and so is the banking system in many other countries. Worldwide, government-appointed puppets are fleeing nations daily as citizens are finally pushing back on their oppressive actions and the theft of their natural resources by foreign powers. Because the media is part of the beast system, you will not hear about these events, but the information is out there. If one chooses to look outside the illusion and escape from the box this power structure has created to steer and control the masses. All I am asking is that before the media and the politicians convince the population that war is inevitable, is for people to try and understand the world's true state of affairs. This is definitely not a defense of China or the CCP or the crimes they have committed on their own people. When facing a conflict that could and has many times before end in mass bloodshed, an honest observer must listen to both sides of the argument to have a clear understanding of what is really occurring. That includes an honest reflection and analysis of the actions of our own leaders that have contributed to our nation being on the precipice of a third world war on several different fronts. One must take into consideration the voices on either side of the conflict, especially when they're both financed and manipulated by the same beast system. Some of these puppets we see right now are the same leaders whose family worked for the bankers that collapsed China 100 years ago. This group is now using the wealth and technology they transferred to China from the West. They're using it to destroy our republic and implement the beast or matrix system under the guise of admiralty law, better known as communism. The system we live in rules us under Roman law. That means if we do not push back against what is going on in the government, that we give our consent. Do they have your consent to start the Third World War over Taiwan? Because they do not have mine. As always, this presentation is made in hopes that never again will the truth be lost in translation. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions in the comments section below. This is Simone signing off for today.